All right. Based on what we covered last week, I know I told you guys to read Daniel 8. We're going to take a slight diversion. And like I said, based on our discussion that we had last week, there were questions about what was going on historically in Israel. So I said, you know what? I think I need to do a study focused on Israel because Israel is what is important. Israel is what we're looking at in terms of history. Israel is what we need to really be paying attention to throughout history as it pertains to the lineage of Jesus Christ. History is what we are concerned with when it comes to biblical prophecy. So we were taking a look at, through the book of Daniel, um, the countries that were outside of Israel at the time, but had an influence or were attacking or capturing Israel. So what we're going to do is do a beeline structure of history of Israel, what was transpiring at that time, their judges, their kings, and all of that stuff, which will help to make better sense when we get back focused on Daniel's prophecy and walk through history to the Intertestamental period. So, the history of Israel and Judah, and it started out with just one nation, which was Israel. And as I go and walk through this, we'll get to a point where we understand when and why it split into two separate nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So between the 20th and 17th century, Israel was wealthy. And the reason why we say they were wealthy, because it tells us in the Old Testament how they went into Egypt because of Joseph, and they prospered in the land. 15th through 17th century, they were still in Egypt. Around the 14th century, the Exodus has occurred, and now they're wandering. And they're wandering for so long because of their unbelief. Because of their unbelief in God. I don't even understand. First of all, the parting of the Red Sea for me would have had me believing for quite some time. 13th and 11th century, they were oppressed. And because of their oppression and their lack of faith in God and what they were going through, God decided to send judges. And then we'll walk through who those judges were. The 10th and 11th centuries, they became united under Saul. Right. So he was the first king that was appointed to them. And we kind of tapped into the fact of how they were looking at all the nations and everything around them. They had a king and, they had God, but they wanted a king. So 10th and 8th, that's when the division came. And that's in the 19 Kings, First Kings. I guess it's First Kings chapter 9. It talks about how that division happened, where certain tribes went to the north and certain tribes went to the south. The 8th century was the actual fall of Israel. Okay, let's see. I'm sorry, girl. Trying to get in. Go ahead and just send the link for fellowship. Okay, so the fall of Israel, that was over 9 dynasties, and Judah was left alone. 8th and 6th century, Judah, around 586 BC, Judah finally and ultimately fell. 6th century BC, they were in captivity and then they were restored. And the 4th century, we find the Old Testament comes to a close. So let me block all of this out so I can see. Okay, so it's here. You guys can see it. 19th to 20th century, we find Abraham. That's when it all kind of first started. He was commanded by God to go to the land of promise that he had told him that was ready for him, and him and Lot left and they traveled to this land. 17th BC, Joseph comes on the scene. If you understand the Old Testament and the history of that, Joseph ended up in Egypt, became a powerful man, and that's what brought all of the children of Israel, God's people, to Egypt. 15th century BC, we find Moses on the scene. Moses flourished in Egypt. Then he became bound in Egypt, right? And he ended up being the individual that God used to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. 14th BC, Joshua. They're now wanderers and they're suffering God's divine wrath because of their lack of faith. As they're on their way to the promised land. 11th century BC, they're in Canaan, which was the land of promise for them. And that's when we see the very first king come on the scene, which is Samuel. And I said that earlier, God's people were trying to be like their neighbors. God would oppress them. They would pray. God would hear their cry. And then God would send deliverers. And those deliverers were called judges. That's where we find the book of Judges. So one of the first judges / deliverer was Othniel. The reason for their deliverance that was required or needed was because of Mesopotamia. Ehud was because they were going against and dealing with the Moabites. Shamgar was the judge. They were dealing with the Philistines. And when we think about the Philistines, we think about David, right? The big giant that David slew. Deborah, the Canaanites, they're in their own land. Gideon, they were dealing with the Midianites. Amalek and Tola, these two judges, they were the defenders of God's people. Jahar and Jephthah, when they were going and battling and dealing with the Ammonites. Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and Samson. Oh, there go Tina. And Samson, that was once again dealing with the Philistines. See how these enemies go and come back and go and come back for them? So Eli was a judge. So for the first time in Israel, Eli combined in his own person the functions of high priest and judge. So that was for the very first time we see this happening in history. And so he judged Israel for 40 years. So they got tired of the judges. They got tired of God's way of doing things. So this is when Samuel comes on the scene. He goes to God's people and tells them this is not a good idea. Y'all begging for a king. Samuel in turn goes back to God, and it's like they're begging me for a king. They're rejecting what you're telling me to tell you. And then God in turn tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. So here we find the anointing of King Saul, who battled the Philistines. And that's when David comes on the scene and slays Goliath. So let's dig into the king of Israel. So the kings of Israel are in the northern region, and then in the southern region, we have Judah. So, very important point. None of the kings in the northern kingdom had any respect for God or worshiping God. None of them was classified as good kings. A lot of these kings in the northern region, you will find, killed their successors. Kings of Israel. Now, this is a lot of information, ladies, and if you would like, let me know at the end of this session. If you have PowerPoint, I can send you this because I think this is a good tool to have for referencing as you're studying the Word of God. If you don't have PowerPoint, I'll figure out a way to put it in a document so that you can have for your use because it's a lot of good information. And going through all these kings, it's just so much information about each one of these kings because there's 19 kings in the northern region and there's 19 kings in the southern region. And then in between that, there were co-regent kings. And so I've tried to tap into some of them, right? But what you see in the red is what I went through and kind of looked at and said, wow, let me put some emphasis on this. So I'm listing the kings, what they did or what they were best known for, and who they actually warred with. So we have David after Saul. And so we know that David united the children of Israel. He warred with the Aboriginal Jebusites, Philistines, the land of Moab, and Zobah, Chalkers. Solomon really didn't engage any wars. Solomon was the one that asked God for wisdom And God asked him, anything you want, I will grant it. He wanted wisdom. He's the individual that built the very first temple. David was going to build the temple, but because of his transgressions, always warring and killing, especially what he did to get the woman that he fell in love with, get her husband killed off, God said, no, you're not building my temple. So Solomon built the first temple. However, I want y'all to watch the pattern of these folks throughout this lesson. Watch their pattern. Solomon built the first temple, but he turned around and disappointed God. He disappointed God because in him seeking all this wisdom and getting all this wisdom, first of all, he had a powerful spirit of lust because he just had so many women, so many wives, so many concubines. And because of what they worship and because of all of the different places they derive from, he began to worship false gods himself. I guess in his research and investigation, trying to figure out something other than what God had presented to him. And one of those first gods was Baal. So God decided to take the kingdom and told him it would be divided. Here is the division. Because of his transgressions, because of his disobedience, because of him worshiping, and not did he worship, he put up their idols, right? God divides the kingdom, and this is where we have the northern and southern that begins to come into history. So his son Rehoboam, during his reign, Israel is divided into the northern and southern region. I just talked about that. Wars and issues that he was dealing with was the invasion of Palestine. He had to battle with the king of Egypt. And we go on down. The palace and the temple were robbed of all their treasures. Remember, we were talking last week about the things that God had created and mandated to be within that temple. Well, right behind Solomon, along comes his son, and the palace temple ends up being robbed of all their treasures, including all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. So Rehoboam trying to actually say, well, you know what? Let me see if I can try to fix this. And him trying to fix this, he substituted with brass. Notice I said initially they were made of gold. So the northern region, as I said, was ruled by 19 kings. The northern tribes had 9 different dynasties. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with what a dynasty is. A dynasty is rule that is passed down through the generations. And this is a very important factor because we know the seed of Jesus had to come down from David, according to prophecy and biblical history. So that's a passing down from, grandfather to father to father to son and grandson and so on. So we're at Jeroboam. Now, what I started putting in here, I was talking to Raquel about this before we got started. I was trying to identify the prophets that were associated with these kings through history, which helps to try to give you a timeline. Because like I said last week, the Bible is not necessarily in chronological order. And that was very fascinating to me in trying to pull together these prophets. So we have Jeroboam, and Jeroboam was exiled by Solomon to live in Egypt. So when he comes back as king, what does he do? He incorporates calf worship after Solomon died. So his war was in retaliation against Damascus. Nadab. Nadab was dealing with a Philistine stronghold. Once again, throne robbers. That conspired against him. They killed him and seized his throne. And here's the thing that I found very interesting. When you get to this northern tribe of Israel, these ruled by these 19 kings, watch how many successors or their ancestor underneath them killed them. I mean, just, I want to be king, I'm going to kill you. I want to be king, so I'm going to kill you. Watch how this happens. So Baasha, okay, he kills Nadab. And so then that exterminated the house of Jeroboam that we see up here. He carried on a long warfare with Asa, the king of Judah. Now, you get that? Israel is now fighting Judah. So, we were talking about what are they fearful of or what was going on. They were infighting a lot. These are their kinsmen. These are their actual kinsmen. Okay, so let me keep going. Elah was killed by Zimri, his successor. He was a drunkard, right? He didn't really do how much of anything. While he was drinking himself drunk in the house, Azra, his chamberlain, one of his military leaders, conspired against him to kill him. Wow, with Zimri. Okay, so check this out. Zimri only occupied the throne for only 7 days. You see this evil strand running through these folks? He burned himself up in his own palace. Oh, mercy. Omri. He ruled along with Tibni, and we'll see Tibni a little bit later. And he was made king by his army. Now, I put emphasis on this red with Samaria because I want you to really take a look at Samaria here. Samaria goes all the way to the New Testament when, if you're familiar with when Jesus stopped in Samaria, he deliberately went through Samaria for a purpose and a reason, and he stops and asks the lady at the well for water. So if you see all the way back here in this time frame of life is the beginnings of Samaria. So his war was a civil war for the throne, and he chose Samaria as his place of royal residence. So here we find a king, a child of Israel in Samaria. And when we go through this study of the intertestamental period, you'll see why this is significant. However, at this time, who's coming on the scene? Syria. So let's keep going. So Ahab. Now, I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with Jezebel. That's a study within itself. Jezebel comes along with Ahab, and she is the first one, or he is the first one, based on her, to incorporate Baal worship. Now, it's familiar in that area because of Solomon, right? Solomon brought Baal worship in. We saw a couple of kings, and now here he comes, and like, let's just bring it right on back in. So defeated Syria, and notice I put here with Shalmaneser II, the king of Assyria, they warred against Syria together. Ahaziah, not let alone Baal worship, now he's seeking Beelzebub as well. And we can see here the prophet Elijah rebuked him for seeking this out. So here we are, false gods, false worship. Where is Jehovah? Jehoram. He did not accept Baal as a god, and he went to war with the Moabites. And he invaded the country, and he besieged Samaria. So that's his war. Jehu. Jehu was kind of a good king. He didn't worship Baal either. And what he actually did was interesting. All of the priests, they had all these high priests all over the land that were actually into this Baal worship, right? And so he told them, well, we're going to all come together and worship Baal together. We're going to have a special ceremony for Baal. And when they all arrived, right, he locked them in the temple and set it on fire. And he burned all of them and killed them. Y'all got that? But look what I put down there in red at the bottom. I'm eliminate Baal worship, but I accept calf worship. If you know the history of the word, and if you know when they left Egypt, the children of Israel, what was the first thing they did? They built a golden calf. So this idolatrous nature of them. Let's keep going with the northern tribe. Jehoahaz. The Egyptian arrived at Rablah on his Mesopotamian expedition, put Jehoahaz in bonds, and later carried him a prisoner to Egypt where he died. So during this time, when we look warfare-wise, Israel was actually subject to Syria. Not much on Joash. He just defeated a king in Judah, which is his kinsman, right? Southern region, still people of God, his kinsman. Jeroboam had a lot of prophets in his ear. Guess he didn't listen, but he was a co-regent king. Zechariah, not the Zechariah prophet, he was killed by his successor, Shalom. Shalom was killed by Menahem, his successor, and Menahem was just known for cruelty. Okay, Pekahiah killed by his successor, Pekah. I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. Oh boy. Pekah was a puppet king for Israel because of Assyria. So we've gone from Syria to Assyria is now on the scene. So this is where, I don't know if you guys remember last week when I was talking about how the children of Israel, a lot of times, oh gosh, it's telling me we're running out of time. Dang it. It's going to end in 10 minutes. So I might have to start it back up, guys. So what we find here is the Assyrians are coming on the scene. And remember I was talking about how they were taking people and displacing them and putting them in other countries and making them miscegenate, have sex with the people that were there. You know, they had to, you know, get couples and marriage and stuff, but their culture, their region. So here we start to see the beginning of the stripping away of them culturally and who they are. So we see the deportation of these inhabitants. And so the Assyrians came, they fell upon Damascus, which was a part of the northern region. And so the invading armies in these upper districts, look at all of the places that they just took over. So it says their inhabitants were removed to certain districts in Assyria, and then I named them here. And then the transplantation of these tribes to a home beyond the Great River was a whole new experiment on the part of Assyria. So about 2/3 of the Sumerian kingdom was then just taken and stripped of everything. I'm gonna try to get to this last, but they're probably gonna cut us off. So Hoshea was killed by Pekah, the next ruler coming up. And he tried to make an alliance with Egypt to try to double cross Assyria. And so that didn't work out. And because of this, quite naturally, he got caught in this thing. They didn't kill him, they just shut him up in prison. So we're at the southern region of the